Welcome. Again, I'm Steven Henry Madoff, the chair of the MA Curatorial Practice Program here at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And today we're going to have our distinguished panel speak to issues that we've prompted them with concerning both their practices, their personal journeys as curators, as well as ideas concerning navigation through an institutional system. And then we will turn to questions concerning our political moment. Unfortunately, two of our speakers at the last minute had to cancel. And I'm just going to say that one of the speakers couldn't come because of concerns regarding the political. And I think that will be an interesting topic to bring up today, considering where we are with the Trump administration and, of course, other countries, which are also in a moment of sudden or not so sudden authoritarian control. The issue of institutions and of curators regarding self-censorship and outright censorship in the world. So with that, I'm just going to turn things over to Işın Önol, the Director of Curatorial Research, to go through how we'll do this today and to introduce the speakers briefly.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Welcome, everyone, and welcome everyone who is watching us online right now or coming to our link later on. Again, thank you so much for being with us on a Saturday morning. As Stephen said, in these pressing times, it is difficult to address politically the pressing issues that are putting us even in more precarious situation. But I'm glad that we are doing this in a timely manner. Here we have 4 speakers with us, as Stephen said. Here there is Susanna Temkin, who is currently a senior curator at Museo del Barrio. And then we have Jovana Venegas, who is also a graduate from our program, and she's currently a curator at SculptureCenter. Then we have Robyn Farrell next to her, and she's currently the senior curator and director of curatorial affairs at the Kitchen. And next to me, there is Bernardo Mosqueira, who is the recipient of 2025 Wilczek Prize. I wanted to particularly mention that, congratulations for that. And chief curator of Institute of Studies on Latin American Art, as known as ISLAA. So I'm not going to be reading your biographies because you will be telling about yourselves. So in every speaker is going to have 20 minutes. First, they will be focusing on their very personal, very briefly, steps of how they came to not to their current positions, but how they became curators. And later on, also their career paths. And later, they will all have 20 minutes each. Then they will also focus on how they are challenging the navigations, both within institutions as curators in this very precarious position that we all know. And also, as Stephen mentioned earlier, in this very current time of the political conflict, how to deal with these topics in a sensitive way, again, within the institutions and beyond in your independent practices. So what we are planning right now is each speaker will have 20 minutes, then we will have a break, and the other 2 speakers will have 20 minutes each. We will have another break, then we will have a conversation all together and hopefully with you. And we are also welcoming our audience who are joining online to ask their questions. You don't have to wait until the end. Please keep writing your questions. We will be reading them. And so I'd like to welcome Susanna first to start.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being here on finally like a spring Saturday morning. As Işın and Steven shared, I'm the senior curator at El Museo del Barrio uptown here in New York City. If you see me looking at my phone, I just have some notes to make sure that I stay on track. So here we are kind of virtually at El Museo del Barrio. But we can start on the next slide so I can share a little bit about how I came to curatorial, which was not always my career path. I always thought I was going to be a historian, but I was really drawn to visual culture and to objects and to formal analysis, thinking about how art can be really revealing about not only the maker, but the historical context in which we live. So I came out of academia, and I'm showing you here El Intelectual by Marcelo Pogolotti, not say that I'm an intellectual at all, even though I'm saying I came out of academia, but Pogolotti was the focus of my dissertation. And I'll return to him in a moment. But I'll say when I was in graduate school, even though I love learning, and I'll say a lot of my projects really come out of archival research, footnotes. I'm like very nerdy in that way. I was very frustrated in graduate school. I wasn't incredibly happy, although I had great colleagues and mentors. And so I found myself constantly doing those free internships because that's how old I am, or, you know, looking for jobs outside of the institution. And one of the places that I found an internship was at El Museo del Barrio. I had like a really transformative experience about what a museum's vision could be and how it can reach multiple communities. I loved it so much that there was actually a job opening at the time, and I applied for it. Thinking that, you know, why am I getting this degree if I can already get the job that I wanted? But I always like to credit one of my mentors, Deborah Cullen, who basically wouldn't hire me and made me finish my degree. And, you know, I'm glad she did. And then, you know, full circle, I ended up back at El Museo. I'm showing you this image also just to share that in my own trajectory in terms of what I have focused on. As an undergraduate, I focused on Golden Age Spain. In graduate school, I really worked on modernist Cuba. I really only wanted to work with dead artists. And now today, I found that, you know, my real passion is in working with contemporary artists, working especially with Latinx, but also other diasporic women artists that haven't always been centered in the canons of art history. I personally have found that, you know, this trajectory speaks to my own biography, but I'm very adamant that, you know, one doesn't have to be from a certain identity to really focus on these matters. I also wanted to bring up Pogolotti because he was active in the 1930s, a period that unfortunately I feel like is becoming really, really resonant. His work was really, he was at the forefront with a number of other revolutionary artists trying to decide how to use art to speak to a public, whether you work in abstraction, whether you work in representation. And a lot of what I learned from focusing on that period, I'm finding to be very timely right now. So maybe we can bring that into the conversation later. We could go to the next slide. As I said, you know, I had this really transformative experience at El Museo while I was in graduate school. 10 years after I had been an intern and part-time employee there, I found myself back at El Museo in time for the 50th anniversary of the institution, which was a really obviously important moment. El Museo was founded in 1969 in the middle of the civil rights movement. Many of our founders are still active, still alive. So that sounds like a very fairy tale story that like I was able to come back to this institution that I loved. But if we go to the next slide, that moment at El Museo was very fraught. Since we were talking about institutional challenges, it was a moment where, you know, many people in the community, although again, I'll share that El Museo has many, many communities that overlap and are different and have different interests. They were really concerned with what they felt the direction of the museum was going, concerned about hires, concerned about making sure that the Puerto Rican and revolutionary legacy of El Museo would be relevant. The image you saw before, to celebrate the 50th anniversary, I did a two-part exhibition, one with our artworks and one with a timeline. And it was such a fraught moment. I decided that rather than ignore what was happening, this was actually the opening of that show. I actually included these different manifestos and charges against the institution within that timeline. So really being very open about how El Museo has, over its course of the history, many times been taken to task by its own community. And it was very challenging. I'll say, like, I speak with other curators at other institutions where, you know, people feel very close to the mission of the institution. It's actually, for me, a really beautiful thing that people actually care and feel ownership over the institution. But at the same time, like, I care about the institution, I love it too. And it's personally, it can be hard. It makes you sad, it makes you, you know, it's just sometimes hard to navigate. So if we go to the next slide, as I said, yeah, there we are. Me and the mask. The way, in addition to being very transparent, you know, the way that I, in my own journey, chose to really contest and to also share that oftentimes we were speaking the same language, the people who had, you know, concerns about the history. I just personally really embedded myself within the artist community. I show up for the artists that have been part of that founding legacy, that are part of like the future of El Museo, artists who are showing here in New York, being really present for them. So this is an image, obviously it's a pandemic image, but it's me with my very dear friend, Hiram Meritstani, one of the founders of El Museo, who passed a few years ago. But you know, he was a big supporter of the institution, of me. He was also extremely critical at different moments. And this is just a moment where we just found each other on the streets of East Harlem, and actually behind us, those storefronts at one time had been a location of El Museo in the past. So again, it kind of just speaks to, I think, like having those encounters, I think is always very helpful, and when the going gets tough. We could go to the next slide. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I just, okay. I brought in one more example of how I try and navigate my position with the institution through exhibitions. So this was a show, Domestica Next, that opened in 2022. Again, like going back to my nerdy footnotes, it really came out of a sentence that Amalia Mesa Baines included in an essay about the porosity of language. She was talking about domesticana, really centering this concept of domestic environments, the home, in terms of a liberatory space for Chicana women. But through this sentence where she talks about you know, the malleability of language, I realized how potent that idea would be for our current context, thinking about the home, not just in terms of Chicana women, but of Latinx artists and gender nonconforming artists as well. So I did this show, Domestica Next, but covertly, I'll say that I try and use shows to hopefully like just percolate some thoughts. So I'm really concerned about the patriarchy. I think as we all are, and power dynamic, I hope as we all are, and power dynamics. So that was one way that I thought that I could, you know, use Amalia's really strident language to subtly oppose patriarchy through this exhibition. We can go to the next slide. This is a work by Amalia that, again, my footnoting or archival fever that I love. She had actually made this piece for El Museo in 1995 for our 25th anniversary show. Together, we reprised it for a 2022 edition. We just acquired it at El Museo this past month, practically. But this show also, you know, I wanted to pay homage to the person who inspired the exhibition, but also I think it's incredibly important for us to have those intergenerational conversations. So to bring in pioneering voices like Amalia, like Hiram, you know, Juan Sanchez, so many artists that are really only getting their dues now, and to bring the younger, today's working artists in dialogue, because I think they're often kept apart. And then I just have one more slide, which is thinking about, you know, where we're at right now in terms of the political environment. So I mean, I'm frightened, I think as we all are, when it comes to issues of DEI, El Museo, you know, we're not removing language, we're not changing language, like we can't do that, we wouldn't exist, it would go against the heart of our mission, of who we are, etc. At the same time, you know, I think we're all really concerned. I'm personally like staying in touch with my colleagues. So glad we're here today, updating one another. But I'm also taking inspiration from Coco Fusco, Pablo Guerra, and Noah Fisher. Coco is someone who we're going to be showing her first US survey in the fall. And to be honest, I was starting to get a little bit scared because she, you know, she's such a political figure. She really goes right to the crux of, you know, so many different power, political dynamics, etc. And then Coco produced The Siren with Pablo and Noah, and really has been talking about using laughter and also confronting the issue and not hiding. So, you know, I'm really taking inspiration from that. I think this is the time we need to be voicing dissent to the best of our abilities. So I hate to always say I take inspiration from artists or artists are always leading us, because I think I don't like to put artists in like carrying that burden exclusively, but I do think, you know, oftentimes they are at the forefront, and it's about how do we make sure that their practice and those ideas, how can we all help further them in our different roles? So that's
Great.
yeah.
Thank you so much. Just for a technical note, because we are trying to do this both in person and online, and we are working with two computers. One is recording us, the other is showing the slides. If you're among the audience and having hard time, online audience, I'm having hard time hearing, please send us a message so that we just turn the other computer sounds on as well. Because today, to be relaxed, we also decided not to use microphones. But if our online audience not hearing us properly, it would be a problem. So thank you very much, Susanna. So before the discussion, let's go on.
Before you do that, so to add to what Işın just said, you can do that in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. I didn't prepare such a formal presentation, but thank you so much, Susanna. It's really wonderful and inspiring to hear your own trajectory. I just brought a few images to share that has really, you know, to start off really thinking about my real encounter with art and how that was formative for my thinking, and it continues to guide my way of like the artist and the ideas that I'm drawn to. So this first image that I brought is the first artwork that I encountered. I grew up at the border, at the US-Mexico border in Tijuana and San Diego. This was a public commission that was made by the artist Marco Ramirez R, who still has done a lot of work with issues around the border. And I would say he's a very important mentor. I was born in San Diego, but I lived in San Diego, but I went to school in Tijuana. So I crossed the border every day. It was part of my day-to-day dynamic. That was just my family and how they decided they wanted us to engage with the border. And this artwork was situated right at the cross, which I think now would be a completely impossible task. This was in 1997. It was one of the last Insight projects. So I saw this artwork. I didn't exactly know what it was. I was 10 years old at the time, what it was. But then later, of course, you know, I began to understand it. And, you know, this is a work that Marcos made. It's a double-headed Trojan horse, you know, so thinking both of that dynamic, the relationship between both countries. And this was really, Erre and a lot of the artists at the border during this period were really trying to understand the context. So they were trying to make sense of, you know, the moment being in the 90s and the 2000s, NAFTA, everything that was kind of taking place in the site. And all of that was, you know, I was encountering this artwork specifically, but others. And, you know, I would really say that encounter with art as something trying to understand the context, trying to understand the social political moment has been still very formative. So we can go to the next slide. And then this is an image, both my father is a photographer and my sister is a photographer. And my father is a photographer of weddings, socialites, a lot of a kind of a formation of class, but really an aesthetic formation of the image. I grew up in a studio trying to really understand how he, formed this very kind of precise image and conception of an image. My sister then, as a contemporary artist who has been very influential to me, took me to all the major museums, as a child. But she was really trying to understand the dynamics of class and power through kind of this formation of the image. And so growing up in this kind of studio within this context of the border was very formative. Again, in terms of my thinking, understanding of like the image, understanding of aesthetics, understanding of like how that is constructed, class, power, dynamics, etc. And so from there, I decided I went to school my entire life in Tijuana. From there, I decided to go do art history at UCLA. And there worked at the Hammer as a student worker in the public programs department. And that was also, this first encounter with contemporary art as a space that is also, a free institution that not only holds kind of contemporary art, but also the ideas that surround it. So all the public programs were taking place with, political kind of commentators. The program director there, Claudia Besser, is still the head of public programs there. But it was addressing cinema, artist lectures. So that kind of encounter with an institution and a museum as a place where all of these conversations could happen, not only around art, but what art surrounds, was also very formative. And then from there, this brings me to kind of the international interest that I have as well. Because from there, I decided to move to Mexico City as an encounter with kind of my, as a border Mexican, it's a very different understanding of like Mexican identity. And I thought that it was an important moment as a young, person coming out of school to really engage with the city, with that landscape. And so I moved to Mexico City for 5 years, where I really came into contact with a lot of artists. It still is a very, very dynamic, bright scene that is, there's like it explodes. I mean, you can kind of see that with the interest that exists now with Mexico City, but this was in 2010, so it's been 15 years. And back then, even more so, there was a sense of true experimentation. Artists opened up their studios to me as a young person that was curious, and, having conversations with them and really understanding what it meant then to, organize an exhibition, which was for me just something that was a way to have conversations with artists and think through an idea together with them. And from there, I moved here to study at this program, actually. And it was also very formative because it introduced me to the landscape of New York City, to another way of like the dynamics of the art world here in the US, how they exist. And also was introduced me to a lot of very important mentors that I then had, which included Maria Lind, who I worked with at the Gwangju Biennial as a fellow, as an intern for, that was kind of part of the fellowship here. And so going to Korea, looking at this other kind of way of making a biennial and being in an international context. And also to Sofia Hernandez Chongui, also a very, very important mentor and friend. Who was at the Cisneros Foundation. So understanding kind of the landscape of how to form a specifically focused a collection of Latin American focused collection. And then from that, I moved to San Francisco to work at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, which was my first real kind of, working within an institutional setting and such an institutional setting. So, as you can imagine, a SFMOMA like the MoMA here is large. It had gone through an expansion, so it had a team of 350 people. And I started as an administrative / curatorial assistant to form the studio department with my dear friend and mentor, Unju Ju. And from there, it was just the two of us working on, I got to work on everything from the start, forming a collection to projects of all sorts, mostly commissions. And that is what I have continued to do throughout my trajectory. I work with artists, I work with living artists, not so much with objects or dead artists. And I take that responsibility and care and relationship very seriously. But so in order to do that within a setting like SFMOMA, it was a lot of negotiation, conversation. You know, I had to really understand the dynamics of being in that place. It took me 6 years to, I would say, understand it. And I brought some examples of what you requested, which was the successes and failures, both within the same project, and which often happen, which we can go to the next slide. This was so I'll say a little bit before I show you the video, but I worked on an exhibition with 3 artists, one of which was Rafa Esparza, and part of his commission was commissioning a new performance. And so the performance, you know, developed over the course of the exhibition, and it developed in the end. He was essentially looking at the history of lowriders, and for him the performance was becoming a machine and becoming a car. And so within that performance, he wanted to bolt pieces of metal to his body, and within like a mechanics, so situated outside of the museum, not within the museum, with a mechanic and in a shop. And so, you know, after trying to negotiate that with the institution as like an SFOMA sponsored event, all of the complications that you can imagine came up, like having a public, you know, with like metal flying, what if the artist gets hurt? All of these, the artist was also bolting it to his face and to his anus. And so it was, you know, all these other kind of sexual questions around sexuality that the institution was not gonna get behind publicly. So what we did instead was to give him all the money for the commission and for him to organize it independently. So we gave him $16,000 for him to organize it, and it was able to then include the video work that came out of it within the exhibition. And I can just show you 2 clips of it because it was very, very beautiful. They're short, it's 30 seconds. This was, I guess because of the light here, you can't see very well, but this is Carla Caterina Canseco, his collaborator, bolting kind of a hose to this. It was with a suit of skin, and then from there to his body. So it wasn't directly on his body. And then the next one was Rafa bolting it to her face. And I would say that then, so it was really beautiful. It was in this mechanic shop. And it in a way, it kind of needed not to have the institution as mediator. So it worked too, because we stepped out of it. And then the failure, which is funny, is that they made these suits that were beautiful. And I thought, oh, we can add them to the exhibition because they're perfect. And that was, I had negotiated so much with the registrars, with the installation team to put the suits on the wall. And it was not possible. I negotiated for 10 days. Please, can we add this work? And it was absolutely not. You know, you had to submit a request to add the checklist, to add this work to the checklist that was then looked at by 10 different people. That was a no. So that was a failure because I overpromised to the artist and said, of course we can put this suit back onto the wall. And so, you know, that's one example. And this other, that was both like a really complicated, you know, just way of like bureaucratic institutions function, and sometimes are really, you know, really, I would say, scared of the artists and the live work and things that shift and change and have, you know, that are somewhat unpredictable. And so that takes me to like the space where I am now, which is completely different. And I'm very happy to be in the institution where I am now, that was founded by artists almost 100 years ago. We're about to turn 100 in 2028. So we're going on our centennial. It was started by a woman artist who wanted a space to show sculpture and to give classes to sculpture. And so that ethos of being truly artist-driven has remained. Our board of trustees is, our chair is Carol Beauvais, who's an incredible sculptor and in the field. Annika Yee is our president, and we have Leslie Hewitt, Nairi Bagramian, all really major artists that have shown at SculptureCenter that are now part of our board, that really, as artists that also make installation, sculpture, very challenging projects, they really let us lead and let the artists lead and let us, you know, don't interfere with kind of the relationship that the institution or curators have with the artists, but instead encourage it very openly. And so, SculptureCenter has that ethos, artist-driven of experimentation and of commissioning. So it's in our DNA, and that gives it another kind of a much more open flexibility of thinking with the artist to develop, an ambitious idea. Sometimes even with artists now, I'm like, what do you want to do? What is it that you really haven't been able to do that you can do? I don't know if we can do it. Now I'm trying not to overpromise. I don't know if we can do it, but let's see how we can get there and what we can achieve as this like space that actually supports the idea and nurtures it. And so that's kind of where we are and where we lie. And I would say that, something that we have been having conversations with, I mean, we're all obviously thinking about it, is where we are currently and what that means in terms of our programming, what that means in terms of how we present on that programming or talk about that programming. And, it's interesting because we're also doing something that I think we haven't done very much at all, but we're doing a couple of surveys. As you were saying with Coco, but also artists that, have been thinking through certain ideas that are very current to this moment for many, many, many years. And as that, I think it's important, to address the situation, but really look back at perhaps practices that have, really considered this and have been talking about this for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And how do we kind of learn from them and those experiences, and how do we kind of bring that conversation now? And something that I think that we've always done, that I was very encouraged by when I joined, is that we write about the artists from the position of the work and not from their biography. Often the biography is important and it comes into the work, and that, of course, we write about it from there, but we do that from the work itself. And so, I was talking to a colleague that was saying there's now these AI scanners scanning through exhibition, like museum websites, looking at the language, how we write about certain shows. And I would say there's nothing really to that would come up, because we've always positioned it from the practice and from the work, and not from the place of identity. And that's just been an institutional kind of thing that we've done for a long time, which was different. At SFOMA, it was actually a struggle, because they wanted to position it from the identity of the artist. And I had a lot of issue, a lot of us had issue with that, because not all artists want that to be part and present of the work. And so something that we instituted at SFOMA that I'm glad that we did, which was the first, and this was a collective endeavor, not just my own, but the first kind of self-identification of the artist in the survey that never existed before. It was assumed when an artist would come into the collection or exhibited, the curator or the registrar or the person that worked on the collection would look at the biography and assume certain nationalities, certain identities, and put that as the record. And so this kind of self-identification is very, very important, because it allows artists to really either say what they want to include, what they don't want to include, and really gives them that opportunity. So those are a couple of the
Great
examples.
Should we take a few minutes break?
Yeah.
And before we take that break, just to say, everyone here, everyone online, you are co-panelists. So we hope that at the end of this, there will be a lively conversation among all of us.
There are already many questions accumulated there.
Great.
During the break, we will be looking at the questions.
Wonderful. All right. So just a 5-minute break.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I'm Bernardo Mosqueira. Well, first of all, thank you for being here. Saturday morning. Such a neat moment to share last Saturday morning. All right. So yeah, I'm Bernardo Mosqueira. I'm chief curator at ISLAA, as it was mentioned, but I'm also the artistic director of SculptureCenter, which is an institution for art and experimentation on art and education in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil. Mention that because it's important that I'm both of them at the same time, and I'm gonna bring a little bit of that situation to this discussion. So I was born in Rio, from a working class family that had no relationship to the arts. So for my family, education was a chance for social mobility, social stability. So we were raised to study a lot, and I was raised to be a mechanical engineer. So I studied actually mechanical engineering for a couple of years when I realized that I would get crazy I did that for my entire life. So I did a free course in an art school in Rio called Paquilage, with this incredible artist called Annabella Geiger. She's fantastic. She was at that time maybe 80 years old, and in one of these classes, she asked us to write a text about an exhibition in the city. I did, and she said, "You have to quit mechanical engineering. You have to become an art curator." And I believed her. She's the one to blame. And we have been working so much since then. She's 95 years old or something like that. And so I quit. I decided to study journalism because I thought at that time that to be an art critic, you had to be a journalist because you write in the newspaper. That was my level of distance from the art world at that time. But it was amazing because I started working in my first semester at the Modern Art Museum as a trainee in the communication department of the museum. And unfortunately, the curator of the museum passed while I was there, and the responsibilities were kind of redistributed temporarily. And I became responsible for things that a 19 years old should not be responsible in a museum big like that. But I had the chance to learn from a very interesting perspective how the ecosystem of the art world, at least in Rio at that time, existed and worked. And after 2 years, I understood that I actually wanted to be a curator, and I was engaging with the artists from my generation. So I would say that my first curatorial school was actually, I think that for most of us, was actually the studios of the artists from my generation, the artists in Rio at that time. And after 2 years at the museum, I decided to leave to make my first exhibition, which was in an empty house that was waiting to be refurbished. And I just invited 44 artists to make a show about freedom. It was called Freedom Is Not Enough. What I Desire has yet no name. It was interesting to realize that because now, looking back, it feels that I have been researching the same thing for 15 years. And we get to that. And so after a few years working, I decided to create my own art space in Rio in 2015. So almost 10 years now, which is Solange La Caxixe. Started as a collective occupying this brewing, this neoclassical building in the middle of the jungle that had no doors, no windows, could not, actually hold an institution, but could hold some temporary exhibitions. After 5 years trying to get the house, trying to buy the house, trying to refurbish the house, we left, became nomadic for a little while, got to a new space. I'm going to show you a little bit of that story later. And in 2019, I moved to the US to do a master's at CCS Bar. So I lived for 2 years upstate, which was amazing at that time. It was during the pandemic a little bit. And moved to the city to work at the new museum. Worked there for 3 years and left the new museum. And at the new museum, had the chance to meet an incredible leadership there and colleagues who gave me a lot of space. I'll also talk about that a little bit later. And I was able to curate or co-curate 7 exhibitions, be part of the curatorial team of the triennial, and then left the museum to when I was invited to be chief curator at ISLAA, where I have been working for 2 years. So that's kind of the journey. And when you invited me to think about these topics of today, I started thinking about how it was for me when I was first studying curatorial practice from Brazil, when very, very young. And I remember that there was a lot of I could encounter many texts and books and magazines and publications, talks about what curatorial work is or what it should be or must be. And that for me was never really inspiring or really moving in any ways. And I was always much more interested in what curatorial work could be or could yet become. And having this very clear to me at that time and still nowadays bring us close to many challenges. Right? When we are posing forms of working that are not yet happening in these institutions, that the institutions are not used to do, like, can we both the face of a person? There's this kind of thing that institutions never did. We have to create new solutions, and then we have to negotiate a lot. The other things that I think that we discussed it's much more common to discuss how to take care of our careers, to make our individual voices heard, but much less about what do we actually do as curators in a society? What are we actually doing here besides putting works on the walls? And I see when you say like, I was very concerned about the patriarchy, this kind of thing, like what are we actually doing, discussing here in institutions, disputing in the ideological dimension through our work, right? And if we are disputing things in the institutions, we are also going to be necessarily negotiating a lot. So just skip that part I mentioned. Yeah. So I also wanted to bring the idea of like how we can dream about what are our contributions to our field, much more than in a rational way, but we are like beings that dream. And this is fascinating. Also, how can we dream our contributions to our networks of life, not only to our fields? And then when I think about curatorial work, and I want to bring that really quickly, we could say that in many ways, but I can very schematically divide it in 4 dimensions, and I'm bringing them because they all can be useful when we are negotiating these situations in our works. Of course, there's academic work, a lot of notes, reading, writing, researching, interviewing, field work, etc. Second one, administrative, great part of our work, Excel sheets, budgets, logistics, timelines, like that's a great part of our work. Funding, fundraising, learning how to get work for what you want to do and how to spend this work in a smart way. Great part of what we do too. Being really good on any of these 3, and especially if you're good on the 3, is going to give you a lot of leverage to make your ideas go through in an institution. So if you bring the money, if you show that you know how to work with managing logistics, etc., to make it through, and also legal issues, etc., and that is all structured in a well-researched project. You're probably gonna have a lot of leverage to make your work happen. But I also wanted to bring up a 4th part of what we do that for me is very important, which is the spiritual part of our practice. We are constantly talking to people who are dead, taking care of their memory, taking care of their souls, their legacies, actually talking to them, actually talking to their traces on the planet, the things that were born from their bodies. We're constantly working with things that cannot be measured, cannot be defined, cannot be verified. We deal with objects that people think they're inanimate, but we understand how alive they are, how the amount of agency that they have. So each person is going to have a different idea of what it is spiritual, and different techniques and or spiritual technologies to deal with their own works. But for me, it's really important to think about that. And then I'm going to bring a few very specific, or I'll try to go quick through these examples about how we go through these 4 things to bring problems to institutions. This is Dan Lee, Brazilian Indonesian artist based in Berlin. When I was working at a new museum, I invited them to make a show, and they brought an idea of making this huge installation that they don't conceive as an installation, but as a living entity, which was this gigantic thing. The project was to make this whole structure with organic material, and plants and mushrooms would grow from it, and then they would get rotten, and flies and animals would. So that was the project. So a museum that is usually a place that is really obsessed with the preservation of objects. The show was about rotting, literally. It was about how the idea of rotting can complicate the idea of life and death, right? So you can imagine how was the negotiation. Can we put this thing inside of the museum to get rotten and make flies and fungi? And there was a lot of negotiation. But again, at the end, working with logistics, but bringing the funds, bringing the solutions for how to deal with the fungi, how to isolate a room, bringing all the solutions of the logistics side, and explaining why this would be important for the institution. And for that moment that we were living, allowed us to make the exhibition. I just brought the images of the beginning of the exhibition, not when it was rotten, full of fungus and flies. But again, the plants came, the mushrooms came, they got rotten, the smell got insane. And it was a very long show. I think it was on for 4 months, or 5 months or 4 months. We had all the different kinds of problems in that regard, but we also had people coming to meditate inside of this room, connecting with the work in such a crazy way, and the institution backed it. I was really happy that we managed to find again a leadership there that said that is great. Let's do it. And that was Denley's exhibition. Then I decided to invite Winnie Minerva, Peruvian, incredible painter, and they have a very interesting practice of painting, but also of body modification. I invited them, and they decided I want to make the largest painting ever made at any museum, and I want to go through a surgery to remove a rib from my body and make a sculpture with it. And I was like, sure, that sounds amazing, because it was a whole investigation about, remaking the myth of Adam and Eve, but now being Lilith and Eve. And now we're going to remove the Adam's rib from the body, and this is going to be the proof that this story existed in the past. So it's kind of like making a fossil, kind of a relic. All right, how are we going to do that? Okay, again, we're going to bring the funds. We're going to show how legally the museum is not going to be implicated if something happened, that we're not, with everything, the museum backed again. And we were able to produce in the same gallery this huge painting. And this was a whole story here with the scene of the, I don't know if you can see my cursor, with the scene of the surgery. And in the middle, you can see Lilith and Eve, and them murdering Adam and Patrick being done here. So we're together in this fight. And at the back of this huge curve, of this huge broken rib, we could find the sculpture with Winnie's rib. Of course, people would get chill and etc. But the institution again backed it, and it was amazing. I'm going to skip this one because I think I'm talking too much, because I want to get to this another kind of negotiation. This is the first building of SLR in Rio. I told you a little bit of the story. We got to this house, this incredible house. This house was built in the early 1800s, so in Rio. So of course, built by enslaved people. Enslaved people worked in the house for a long time. So crazy house, but it has also this dense and dark story to it. In a certain moment of doing exhibitions there, and we were constantly talking about one of the former owners of the house was this feminist who actually fought for the rights of the women and the students and etc. We realized that every time we would have maybe one step aside quickly. Everybody who's part of SLR is part of Candomblé, which is an Afro-Brazilian religion that is very, very well represented right now at El Museo, at Mestre Gigi's exhibition. I think that Jovana Venegas is also connected to it. It's coming soon in at the SculptureCenter. So everybody is part of Candomblé. So we have a spiritual practice. We were constantly talking about this former owner of the house, and then we realized that every time we would have an exhibition with a work that had a snake on it, or that was a snake, we would have problems in the house. So we were that is something happening there. Nothing happened, but every time we have a work with the snake, something happened. So we went to the oracle in Candomblé. And the oracle at a certain moment asked, you have been talking about the owner of the house, but there is a man with a snake related to the house. spirit here in the house. So we remember that in the very first meetings that we had to negotiate with the owners of the house to use the house for this purpose, the oldest granddaughter of this former owner of the house was still alive, 19 years old, told us the story about this man who used to work there, and someone came to complain that he was living with a snake and asking him to kill the snake. And then he said, I cannot kill the snake because the snake was a gift from Dona Luz. Dona Luz is Luz de Fuego, really important performer and nudist activist in Brazil in the early 1900s. So this guy had this story there, and they were like, oh my God, is this guy? So the oracle said, yes. And he's asking to be called Obadan, the king of the snakes, and you have to worship him. All right. We nurtured also him as an ancestor of the house. So we spent 5 years in the house making exhibitions, crazy experimental exhibitions, Vivian Kakuri, Ernesto Neto, Denilson Baniwa. The openings of these exhibitions were incredibly strong, with an educational component, with kids from different schools and from the neighborhood and different regions. Edgar Kalel, this work was sold to Tate later, Annabella Geiger. And then after 5 years, we realized that we were spending too much energy and money in the house, and we should focus more on the program. So we became nomadic. We followed the movement of the river to the sea and started making exhibitions in other regions of the city, outside, and also at Favela da Maré, Complexo da Maré, at the Modern Art Museum, in partnership with different organizations, Tropical Pão, in an actual waterfall, work in an institution that can make performances in waterfalls, and or make them. And then finally, we found our new headquarters, 2023, when we made completely different, as you can see, where we could make much more stable and strong processes with residencies, art studios, library. We can see Luana Vitra here, Jovana here at the corner, and again discussing very tough topics. But we had to make this whole thing from scratch, this whole institution from scratch. We have now 30-something people working, 3 boards, but a structure that allows us to make exhibitions about the history of voguing in Brazil, etc., etc. But what I wanted to show you is that after this is the new facade of the place. After we went through all this thing, we nurtured the ancestors of the other house. We learned from them that we had to leave this experience of being nomadic. We were brought to this house. Someone offered this to us in a very interesting situation, and we saw the space. We said yes, to the moment that we found on the very top of the building this name. I don't know if you can see. Can I move that?
I think so, yeah.
I don't know how.
Just draw it exactly.
So when we got to this house, we found the snake over there. So sometimes you have to negotiate with the board. Sometimes you have to negotiate with the spirit. So that's pretty much it.
Thanks everyone for coming today and tuning in from home or wherever you are. I'm Robyn Farrell. I'm Senior Curator and Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Kitchen here in New York. Just to give a very a brief intro before I get into sort of my curatorial journey, did not start specifically in the realm of art history. I also didn't grow up in an artistic household. I grew up in Illinois, in a city that's about 2 hours northwest of Chicago. There's no train that goes to Chicago, so Chicago could have been New York, say for an annual trip, this, that, or the other. My point is I didn't have I didn't grow up going to museums or things like that. But there was a very Bernard theater scene where I grew up, and my aunt was actually very involved. So I actually entered into undergrad as a costume designer because I was very interested in how history and socio-political movements are tracked through the way we dress. And I was in the program only for a year though, because I quickly realized that I was really only interested in researching and not actually making garments. So I luckily followed a friend to an art history class one day, and then I realized that that was sort of the direction that I wanted to go in. So I say that because it kind of kicked off about 5 years of me trying to figure out where I would land within the kind of art landscape. And I did not start off in museums. I had some internships in undergrad, but actually what was most transformative for me and what I consider to be sort of the beginning. While I was in graduate school at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, I worked for Donald Young Gallery. And for those of you who are maybe not familiar with Chicago contemporary art, Donald Young and Rona Hoffman really single-handedly brought contemporary art to Chicago in the 1970s. And they had two eponymous galleries in the 80s and the 90s where conceptual artists kind of came to the Midwest for the first time. Bruce Nauman, Martin Currier, Vito Conchi, Barbara Kruger, Jenny Holzer, etc. They originally, it was Hoffman Young Gallery, and then they broke off in the 80s. And I worked for Donald Young the last 3 years of the gallery, the last 3 years of his life. And it was really formative for me because he, by this point, had been a dealer for 30 years. And he was not in this moment in his career where he was beholden to sales. And so the program was really artist-centered. It was a small operation. There were only 3 of us, but he did these like magnificent, massive shows where he showed a lot of mostly European artists in the Midwest. And it was just an incredible introduction for me, but also thinking about how lens-based work and installation kind of come together. And that was really, I had a very traditional art historical undergrad because I was at a state school in Illinois. And so this was like very eye-opening for me. And I became quite interested in the circulation of images and how they operate in the world. More specifically, because when I was organizing all the records for the gallery, Donald was one of the earliest gallerists that successfully represented video artists. And so in addition to, you know, Bruce Nauman, he worked with Bill Viola and Gary Hill, and they had their careers really took off because of his support. And so I became very interested in sort of the model of video editioning and kind of dove into that through my graduate research at SAC. So they kind of were in tandem with one another. And to kind of touch on what you were saying, working at a gallery was incredibly important from a logistical and administrative point of view. I mean, there was only 3 of us, and so it was Donald, the director, and myself. And so I did everything. I did registrar work. I wrote the press releases. I was on hand to work the technical aspects of installations when our, you know, part-time installer wasn't around. I mounted fairs. I did sales. I did everything. And it really was incredible training for what would turn into, for me, a curatorial career. This was the moment where I knew I wanted to work with artists. I wasn't exactly sure what trajectory I would go on. And then Donald, unfortunately, tragically passed away very quickly from pancreatic cancer. And I was still in graduate school, but at the time, there was an opening at the Art Institute of Chicago for a curatorial assistant position in the contemporary department. And so all of the training at the gallery actually really set me up to be in a very similar role, but just working for 2 of the curators in the contemporary department. And I immediately was able to get a different kind of training that was working within this like major institution, all the while I was finishing up my graduate work at SAC. And I bring up what my area of focus was, which was the early beginnings of conceptual art and video, which I would argue in the Western story would be with Gary Schum in Germany, in the Firenze Gallery. he was the first to work with artists to think about how one conceives of work to be seen on a curved screen. The work that he did, the very brief but pioneering work with Forensic Gallery, was this idea that he was a Marxist and he very much felt that art belonged to the people and therefore no one should collect art. And so he embarked on this 2-year project where the gallery didn't exist except for the moment of transmission on TV. So he was a documentary filmmaker and he was able to launch this project by convincing the national television station to let him do these programs, where, as you can see, the artists on the screen, Richard Long, Barry Flanagan, Dennis Oppenheim, Robert Smitham, Jan Tibbets, etc. He was able to work with the major artists of the day and basically taught them all how to think about putting artwork on TV. And the work was broadcast at the end of the day, like at 9 o'clock at night, and it came on with no educational context at all. And then it was gone. And that was it. There was like nothing that happened after. He sent out postcards, so there's really only ephemera that exists. From this time, the follow-up program was called Identifications, which was putting performance art and some of the key artists from Art Povera on television. He lost his contracts, obviously, because the television stations didn't appreciate that this wild work was coming on TV without any explanation. And then he essentially found himself working out of the back of Conrad Fisher's gallery and came up with the idea of how to basically start selling these works. He did an about face and started selling these works in editions. And this was a model that he established well before Leo Castelli. But he was, before his time. This was 1973. Not every museum even had a way of showing these video editions. And so he committed suicide. And because of that, he is really more or less not known. And I discovered this during all my time working for Donald. And so I couldn't find anything in English. Nothing had been published in English. A couple of shows in the 70s and 80s. Barbara London bought some of the work here at MoMA in 1979 or 80, and nothing's ever been shown since. There's none of the work is in any American institutions. So all this is to say is it kind of embarked on this journey of like a 5-year program where I was able to show his work on educational purposes for one-night only screenings, is the way the estate has it marked out here in New York and also in Chicago. But I am spending some time on this only to not only obviously this was sort of a different kind of curatorial work. It is always going to be my, it's this never-ending project. His widow is still alive and she holds close all rights to his work. So there's no reproducing images, there's no exhibitions. So I'm constantly trying to figure out ways to show his work because, he worked with artists like Richard Serra and taught them about television. And then Richard Serra came back to the United States and did all these television works. And then people think that television art started in New York, right? That's not true. And there were lots of similar programs and projects happening all over the world. I want to say this is just one example. So a long-term dream would be to do something about all the different television projects that took place during this time. But this just fueled my interest in, again, thinking about distribution models, how artwork is accessible, how it's shown, how it's shared. And even though for the next 10 years, I was working at the Art Institute, which was obviously a very different mode of exhibition and art sharing, the seeds of this project and this interest in this ethos are present within each project that I did. So from Donald Young, I began working at the Art Institute of Chicago. I started as curatorial assistant, then assistant curator and associate curator. There was a note about kind of how did you get your voice out, which I will give some examples at, but similar to kind of you, and for those of you again who are not in Chicago, you can't actually be a part of the art community in Chicago and not run some kind of exhibition space out of your home. It is just part of the zeitgeist of living in that city. And so while I was a curatorial assistant at the Art Institute, I ran a space out of my apartment called Open House. And it essentially was just a way to to show work on screens. So I had, monitors and TVs on in my house, and each room had a different screen. Some of it was new work with friends and artists that were in Chicago. Some were archival works. This is an image of my backyard where we did a huge concert we probably shouldn't have done with an organization called Chances Dances, which is this queer space, a roaming queer space in Chicago that was celebrating its 10-year anniversary. And so we hosted a performance of Bastard Geist you see here, and there was a video being projected on the back. But this was really important for me because at the time I wasn't doing any of my own work at the Art Institute. So it was sort of this simultaneous moment where I was trying to figure out my curatorial voice, both inside and outside of the institution. The poster to the right is my homage to Gary Shum, which I did with Acre TV. Acre is an artist residency that is based both in Chicago and in Wisconsin. And Acre TV was this 24-hour online broadcast platform, basically. And I did 24 hours of programming for them, which was sort of this idea of what my way of trying to figure out, get closer to Gary Shum's thought process. So that's one example of something I did outside of the institution. And I was at the Art Institute for 10 years, and I joined the kitchen a year and a half ago. I moved here and as senior curator, and I am working with Lexi Russell, who's our executive director, on our 53rd year now operating. The kitchen started as an artist collective and really was born out of this idea to make a space for experimentation and process without holding artists to having an end result. Its failure is fine. There's really no definition of success. It's providing the space and the platform. The kitchen began as the kitchen, which was the center for video and music. And we were literally in the kitchen of the Mercer Art Center in 1971. And then we moved to space in Soho in 1974. And we were there for about 9 years before settling in Chelsea in the building on 19th Street, which is we own and is currently under renovation. And so our temporary space right now is in Westbeth Artist Housing in the West Village. But this exhibition, which I organized in the fall of 24, is an example of our Without Walls program, which is this simultaneous exhibition program of shows and performances that happen outside of our walls, because we are at a time where we have 3,000 square foot loft in Westbeth, but it's nothing near the 4-floor building that we had. We're operating out of on 18th Street. So we're actively collaborating and partnering with other institutions, organizations to bring the kitchen outside of its brick and mortar space, which goes along with, again, kind of this my drive to kind of think about how art is accessible, and it doesn't need to necessarily be within what would be a formal institutional space. I did what I call a mini survey of work by Cheryl Sutton, who is a choreographer, dancer, and performer, and she was kind of an essential part of the New York performance scene in the 70s and the 80s. She was a muse and longtime collaborator of Robert Wilson. And she performed at the kitchen in the 70s. This is on the left is an installation image of a recording of Paces in 1978, which is a rarely seen and shown performance work of hers. And then to the right is this iconic image of her that Peter Hujar shot also in 1978, I believe, maybe it was 77. And a press release of video that by Bob Wilson that was broadcast from the kitchen on TV in 1982. And so I actually did this small archival video show at 47 Canal, which is a contemporary art gallery currently housed in the kitchen's old space in Soho. So we did this entire recreation of the kitchen in their back room. And it was this really lovely moment where we were kind of taking aspects of the kitchen's history and putting it into a contemporary space. And we invited Cheryl to come and speak about her work and her career, because although she has been so important and working and still continues to work, she's a figure that has been overlooked. And I will kind of just use this as a moment to talk about how, you know, that is really kind of what's some of the things I've touched on is this idea of like an artist forward centered approach to curatorial work. And every institution I've worked in has really honored that direction. And I think as I try to kind of to give an overarching idea of what my purview is that it's of course driven by this idea of accessibility and collaboration, but it's definitely kind of this back and forth between historical and contemporary moments and how they're constantly in opposition and dialogue with one another. And that of course probably comes from working at an encyclopedic museum for 10 years and working with contemporary artists. But the kitchen is that actually, even though now I'm at this smaller nonprofit that deals primarily in time-based work, our archive, which is, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of records of 50 years of production in New York, that kind of serves as a collection that artists are still actively working with. We see it as not a dusty old reference point, but as an actual actor in our contemporary program. So that's my all right, hold on, one more thing. So when I moved to New York, I was asked to organize the focus section of the Armory Show last year. I'd never been involved in an art fair, and I was kind of interested in how that worked, and also just having just moved to New York, I thought it would be a good way to enmesh myself further. And so this is another example I pulled out to think about what are traditional and what are alternative spaces. An art fair can't get more commercial, I think, than that space. But this was a really lovely opportunity where we were celebrating the history of the Armory Show, which actually began quite radically as a very experimental presentation of work by young dealers at a hotel in the 1990s. So this particular presentation brought work together by Oliver Herring that he did in the 1990s. The Mylar mesh you see was a knitting project that he embarked upon from the late 2000s, mid-90s to 2000s. And it was a way for him to deal with the grief of all of his friends, lovers, collaborators that were falling victim to AIDS. And the video you see in the back was his first video that marked actually the end of this knitting production. And so this was like this really micro, amazing, historic, this first time the work had been shown together as a historic presentation at a fair. So I feel like that is one of the things I'm really interested in, is kind of pushing at the boundaries of what like a commercial space could be. And then we organized an offsite performance that Oliver did, and this is Oliver on the right. So this was an area, a way for us to actually embark on showing new work in a space outside of the fair that has really kind of propped up and brought a renewal to the visibility of his work. So getting back to sort of how do you navigate through institutions. I was a curatorial assistant at the Art Institute. I came in with this deep background in video art history and expertise. I more or less became the de facto person on staff that dealt with installing time-based media. So I worked very closely with all of our techs, and I just made myself overly interested and available to kind of oversee all of these programs, because I was equally writing labels, for Charlie Ray and painting shows and whatever, but this was sort of what I was consistently making myself available for. And so there's a video gallery in the Art Institute's Modern Wing, and I essentially kind of took that over and was able to program it from our collection 3 to 4 times a year. We did this on a shoestring budget. I mean, I think each presentation was less than $3,000. Some were more if we had some funding. But it was really the way that I was able to actually not only kind of make my mark, but actually kind of carve out a space within a big institution that didn't necessarily make a space for me initially. And so this was where I was able to really experiment. This maybe doesn't seem like a huge deal, but it was a very big deal where we presented work by Andrea Fraser that was in the collection in this video gallery. And then I went through all these different meetings and, presentations about bringing the video into the public space of the museum, which maybe doesn't seem so radical, but it was at the time. And so it was sort of like pushing the needle forward slowly but surely to try to intervene, interrupt, and shift the rules of engagement within a major institutional space. And so this is an example of that. Another example is a project I did with Rodney McMillian. We acquired 4 videos of his work and presented them in this video space. And at the time, we approached him to think about doing a performance. And it's hard to see, but this is sort of the challenge I wanted to pull out, where if you look at the dating here, the video presentation is very different, is much earlier than the performance. We had wanted them to be simultaneous. So the video presentation was from January to March of 2017. And the performance was from October, was a weekend in October of 2017. It took us quite, so Rodney said, yes, I'd love to do this, but I don't want to do performance in the Art Institute because the people I want to do this performance for don't come to the museum. And so the Art Institute had never really thought about doing a program that was outside of the museum. And so Rodney came in, he's based in LA. We went, did all these site visits to all these different places. And we went to the Southside Community Arts Center, which is a National Historic Treasure. It was one of the first Black-run education centers that had an affiliation with School of the Art Institute. And he wanted to do it there. And they were very reticent to partner with us and very, questioned why we as a big institution, why are we wanting to take over their space? And so it took months of working with that executive director and that board and with Rodney to finally, kind of come to a place where we all felt, they felt comfortable kind of having us take over their space. And it was very, there were many moments throughout this process where we didn't actually know if it was going to happen. So it was really wonderful when we were able to do it, but it was definitely something that hadn't been done before. Continued to push the envelope as far as I was my position in the contemporary department, but it also was a practice in extreme negotiation. Another place that I was able to sort of exercise voice, and I'm sure other colleagues at museums can talk about acquisitions. As a junior curator, I didn't have a huge budget and I didn't have a whole lot of opportunities to propose acquisitions, but there was a patron group that sponsored major acquisitions once a year. And sometimes the presentations, it was myself and the other curators in the department. So for example, they acquired the Emma Amos Black Dog Blues from 1983. And despite all of my efforts, that they did not acquire Leticia Fuentes, trademark in 1975. And so there's successes and there's disappointments. And I think it's important to kind of acknowledge those things. The fact that we had Leticia's work in the Art Institute was a huge win, I think, because it was up for about, 3, 4, 5 months. And all the institutions were able to come and show their classes and everyone saw this work. So that alone was something that I felt was really important, even though I wasn't able to line up enough funding or support to acquire the work. Major exhibitions would be the other, and commissions would be the other example. I did the Chicago I co-curated the Chicago presentation of Greg Bordowitz's I Want to Be Well. You might have seen the New York presentation at PS1, and it started at Reed College previous to the Art Institute. At the time, Greg was a professor and head of the part-time program at this school. Greg did not have gallery representation at the time. I had wanted to work with him for a while because I was really familiar with his video work. And then, basically he was like, this is great. Reed College is doing this survey of my career. We're like, oh, that's great. Sorry, we don't have any space. And then something dropped off our calendar and we were able to actually take the show and expand it. It went from a 1,500 square foot college presentation to a 5,400 square foot 2-gallery show. It was the largest survey that, expansive you'd ever had. And working with Greg was another kind of point in how I find that artists really kind of influence and lead and guide my way of thinking. I had always been very forthright about accessibility to art and images, and I was not as thorough in the idea of accessibility from a visitor standpoint. That was something that Greg instilled insofar as we captioned over 7.5 hours of video. We had serious meetings of how benches felt, how we could provide enough seating. The ways in which the work was available. We partnered with the video data bank to put it online. And it was just opened my eyes to how to think really holistically about presenting work and working with artists. I did Barbara Kruger's anti-retrospective, as she calls it, in 2021. This was the biggest and most robust show the museum had ever done up until this point. She was the first female artist to have living female artists have a solo show in our major exhibition space. This again is in 2021, just to remind everybody of the year. Mary Cassatt and Georgia O'Keeffe were the only two previous women to have major surveys in our primary space. So this is a big deal. And of course, as mentioned, opened in 2021. So it was delayed for over 1.5 years. There are many points where we didn't even know if it was going to happen. So we focused really on the publicness of her art. Barbara deals in direct address. We're talking about, politics, both Barbara and Greg. I mean, Greg is the longtime AIDS activist and educator as well as an artist. So both of them deal in conceptual art through modes of mass communication. And so this drove about 5 years of my production at the Art Institute. And so for a long time, we focused on, for the first time, the museum turned over its entire marketing campaign to Barbara. She actually did all of the copy and the designs for everything in our marketing campaign. Because we thought that actually was going to be the show. We really didn't even know if we were going to be able to show anything. And so when obviously everything changed and we were able to move forward with our plans, the billboards, the murals, everything stayed across the city. And then we did this huge, massive projection onto the Merchandise Mart in central downtown area. Public art obviously is part of the Art Institute's program. I did a public installation and commission with Maren Hassinger. This is the only free space at the Art Institute that's accessible to the public. And again, Maren was the first woman of color to have a solo show on that space. So a lot of what I've done, at least working in a big institution, was trying to find ways to bring in voices that had either been minimized or overlooked. And the institution was always very supportive in that. This is another example of a major work that I installed and acquired at the Art Institute, and it's a bridge to the kitchen. And this idea of how we can think about collaboration, simultaneity across time, across geographies, and across media. And it's a lot of where I've been working and thinking in for the last 1.5 years. These are 2 examples of online programs that we do, which again, this is the idea of making work accessible, with which Patricia Dominguez was very, very excited when I reached out to her, because she said, this is the only way I get to see work. I can't believe that I get to be part of the kitchen's history. And my work's going to be visible to the world. This is a current show that's up right now, Lisa Alvarado, and I'm going to end with this because we talk about how do you see forward, what's within this moment in time with these politics. Specifically at the kitchen, I think it's a little bit, this idea of risky play and experimentation is central to our mission. And, art inherently is political, and as a, curatorial practice is not independent of what's happening around us. And so I'm able to kind of work more immediately. The shows I just showed you from the Art Institute happen over 3, 4, 5, 7 years at a time. I've known Lisa for years because she's in Chicago. She's part of Natural Information Society, which is a musical ensemble. This is an image of them playing inside the space just a few weeks ago. Her work kind of came out of becoming their paintings for backdrops for the band. And she's never had a major institutional show in New York. And I wanted to give her the opportunity also because this is our loft. This is our loft at Westa. As you see, it's all windows, there's no walls. And so her work really was meant for the space, but more importantly, her work is very much influenced by her background as she was born and grew up in Texas in the borderlands, and her work is really influenced by this idea of not only American muralism and music, but her own family's history of being part of the first, deportation of Mexican Americans, Mexican immigrants, and US citizens between 1929 and 1936. These are images of her family that were all forced to leave the United States, even though they had been citizens for years. And they were only brought back to be migrant laborers, and had to resettle in this way. So this is part of her work and had always been part of our plan for the exhibition, but of course brings in this urgency and moment of discussion, which is of course ever present.
All right.
Thank you.
So let's take a short break just for 5 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation and bring everybody into it. So let's come to the conversation part. Thank you for the presentations. And the idea is that, we're going to prompt a little bit just to get you guys going and let the conversation go where it goes. And you can also start asking questions as well. I think we're continuing the same relaxed way. And I wanted to start by, I was thinking of the comment about, well, if you bring all these things to bear, the administrative, the funding, the logistics, then you have leverage. But I wasn't hearing that from everybody. And it made me think, well, it's not always the case that you're in the position to do the fundraising as well and maneuver in that way, particularly in a larger institution like, you talking about SF MoMA.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if we could start by reframing it in terms of scale of institution and how you do that. Because again, the whole point of this being called a workshop is to compare notes with curators in the audience, students in the audience, to think about, well, how do you do that? Right? As it's part of this program, curatorial practice. It's all about how do you do something? How do you do the practice? So, who would like to kind of ask somebody else a question or start the conversation that way?
I think I'll start off by saying that I always, whenever I'm going to sort of ask this question or in having these sorts of talks, I try to emphasize the least sexiest thing, which is administration. For me, I think is the most important thing, because you could have the funding, but if you can't balance a budget, or if you can't communicate or liaise across, union workers in the shop and, folks in education and whatnot, it kind of doesn't, from my experience, it actually doesn't matter if you actually can't keep a budget, if you can't stay on deadline, if you can't manage expectations of an artist. And so I actually think that administrative and project management, having a good grasp of those essential skills, I see as sort of being the most fundamental. Insofar as putting theory, putting ideas into action. And that obviously is very influenced from my own background, which of course started administratively, working at a gallery and then working administratively for years within an institution. But it really kind of, I think, provided my view into like, okay, now I can do these very big projects, huge budget, because I know how to do them. And now that I'm in a small institution where literally every penny matters, I'm very grateful that my training was the way that it was, because I don't know how we would actually execute some of the things that we do out having such a full understanding of these like very detailed operations. So that's one thing I'll say that I always try to overly emphasize in speaking to folks.
I agree with you, Robyn. But you use the word administration, but I think some of this is also, it's diplomacy, but it's also
Right, of course, yes.
it's also like collegiality, both internally with your peers, from like, you know, your art handlers to your educators to your upper management, but also externally with other organizations that I think like also as like a fellow tiny museum, like we're all gonna need to learn how to work across institutions in order to make things happen. And I think that the way we are currently set up, and by we, I mean, not just a museo, but like a professionalized museum space, it's not, we're not in that direction yet. And I, myself included, like I'm the one who, I think all of you come out of more, like your training seems to be with artists, like mine is in like the academy. Like I'm an art historian. I didn't go to, a curatorial focus graduate school. I find myself really unlearning a lot, and I think I have a far way to go to do some of like the more radical things that I think you're doing, Bernardo, at Solar. But it's gonna take a lot. Like if I'm feeling that from the individual perspective as someone who wants to be there, like it's gonna be really hard for us to get on board and to like help motivate our institutions, plural, to get there too, I think. But I think if we don't do it now, then like forget it. We might as well go home, you know.
I mean, I think a big question on my mind and maybe the mind of others is funding and really, you know, what's going to happen with funding, how does it work? So, you know, at SFLMA, there was an entire giant development team that was in charge of fundraising, and they were in charge of the, you know, the donors and nurturing that. And I would say that I would come in at different moments to like do tours or encourage, like present on the collection or acquisitions, etc. But there was a bit of a distance. And here it's not, you know, when I came in, my team, we're a team of 9 people now, and my team, my director and my deputy director said, you know, you have to worry about fundraising. But I do feel like as a small team, it's a shared responsibility to fundraise and to think about that. Especially as curator of the projects, you're kind of the one that knows the most about the project as it's developing, as it's happening. So I do now find in this role that although it's not necessarily required, I do enjoy it. And I think it's important to figure out, you know, how to fundraise and how to talk to people. And that's also part of like, talking to other colleagues and seeing, you know, are there any donors that you think maybe would be interested in this particular show and sharing that resource, you know? And I think that, yeah, it's as a smaller institution, I think that we are thinking of other models of like, you know, $1,000, $2,000, if you raise that, that's great. You know, that's somebody's contribution actually makes a big difference to us because of the scale, and we can do a lot with kind of that amount of money. But it is something that I think, you know, with the NEA and like the language that is happening around that, we don't get a big chunk of our, it's still a chunk of the funding. And so, you know, all of that, and I think funders and donors are, you know, thinking about finances a little bit differently because they don't know exactly where they're going to need to support and place that money in. So it is, I think, something that is like actively a conversation that we're all trying to figure out, and how to do that maybe collectively and share, and experiences or contacts or resources is a way that I feel like we can move kind of forward.
Yeah, I had different experiences and different needs in different contexts. At Solar, of course, we are responsible for fundraising for the entire institution for paying the salary of 30-something people and all the programs and etc. So in 10 years, that gave us a wide range of development and fundraising techniques. That some of them are specific to Brazil, some of them not. But for me, it was always just regarding in which institution to be able to bring additional money. First, I've never been in a situation that I said to an institution, I have that money, I could bring that money, and the institution said, no, you're not in the position. So bringing additional money for a program and exhibition was always welcome. I learned so much at any museum. Their development department is has been amazing. It was amazing to work with them. But again, it's like you have this space, you have this budget. Okay, but the project costs much more. All right, figure it out. Go find the money, and then you have to go find the money. Personally, I love fundraising. It's not that not because of the process itself, but for what it allows to do. Gives a lot of autonomy. And I also never worked in a situation that the money was a lot, but it was just like, here's the fund. Money is not a problem. I've not been in that situation, so that was always part of the process of imagining an exhibition. For me, imagining an exhibition is not figuring out a project and then there's the money as another part. It's everything's together. How to make it feasible, how to work with your team. Everything kind of happens at the same time. So I can't dissociate thinking a show and thinking about the funding, right? And right now it's like, oh, it's gonna be hard. It's much harder for other people in the other part of the planet. So I'm sure that American people are going to be able to figure it out, and institutions are going to be able to figure it out.
I mean, just to switch a little bit around that idea, because you come from a country that has had an authoritarian regime, is there something from that experience that informs the experience now in the US, considering that we're facing all kinds of political challenges? I said to Işın, I'm giving that to you, but I'm sorry, I just have to jump in with that. And Işın, of course, comes from another regime, especially at this moment. So maybe you could also speak to that.
And right now, at this point, 12 p.m. at Zikoti Park, all my friends, colleagues are coming together because of what's happening in Turkey right now. But thanks, Steven. So, because it's good to have seen all your personal and professional journeys. It was quite incredible to hear your transformative experiences in these institutions and your personal decisions and how your voice grew and grew in these different settings. It was also good to see these diverse range of institutions, independent ones, grassroots ones, then to more greater institutional settings. So within this great map, and also the transnational aspect was there as well, with the background, and within the US, the difference from New York to Chicago, etc. Having said all of that, now also coming back to your question, what could be curating otherwise? And coming to Steven's point, what is now at this very pressing point? Yes, particularly in the US, but simultaneously a lot is going on in the world right now. We are in some sort of simulation of perhaps, I hope not, but it really is in some areas sounds like 1940s again. So what is our role now? How do you see? It's a little bit of a speculative thinking, of course, but how do you see your roles of navigating these current challenges and how it will reflect on your curatorial practices?
And if I might add to that, what I said at the beginning, that one of the potential speakers today had noted that their institution had said, we're not comfortable with you speaking about political issues. And so that speaker withdrew from this conversation. And so, this idea, it immediately occurred to me, well, are we then really actually now dealing with self-censorship on an institutional level, which is, of course, the most dangerous thing. So
again, to add on that, some of our non-citizens, and it immediately changes, like in social media, seeing a lot of even green card holders are not being welcome anymore in the country, etc. The fear is already there. And I find it, as a person, very surprising, because I was finally thinking, all right, we are in a space where we have the artistic freedom of artistic expression or freedom of speech, etc. One more thing I'd like to add from my personal experience there, because of going through a time of resistance in Turkey and how the authoritarian regime developed in time, the social media sometimes reminds you what you shared 10 years ago. And I always feel the shock was I able to say those things then that I can't say now? And I see that sort of risk right now in this country. And the freedom of artistic experience now is in question, of course. So having that all in mind, what would you like to say? Of course, bearing in mind that we are online and we are having this conversation.
Which will be recorded. Who would like to jump in?
Yeah. So first, freedom is never guaranteed. It's not something that is given. I think that we can take that out of our perspective. It's not given. It's always in dispute. How can I? I'm gonna try to add like different anecdotes maybe. First, we were doing we have a show right now at ISLAA called Buenas de la Noche. There's a show around a group of trans women from Caracas, and a documentary that was made around them in the early 80s, sex workers too. So we had a panel with a group of very young, amazing artists and activists that are also trans and also sex workers, and it was amazing. And we put together the panel. We invited them, and the first thing that they said, and they repeated, each person in this panel was, "We're not going to say we're tired of people saying now more than ever, at this moment more than in any other moment, because it's always been a dispute. We've always been threatened. It's not that now it's going to be more than before. It's always been a dispute." So for me, I wasn't expecting that, but that was very meaningful. That was very meaningful. I was like, who was the current state of things good to? The actual establishment of the power dynamics and the distribution of power, on how resources and violence were distributed unevenly. Who was actually it good for? So for them, as for many others, migrants, undocumented people, it wasn't the paradise. We're just like continuing the dispute. It's going to be harder. Yeah, it's going to be harder. But if we look back, not so long ago, we were disputing having women in institutions, in institutional exhibitions. We were disputing having not white or not only people born in the US in the exhibitions. It's not long ago. So it's not that we had won all the battles and that we were ready and it was like perfect, and now everything's falling apart. We were still in the middle of the battle. We're just going to continue it. Of course, in the past decades, we won a sequence of battles. Let's say we had a number of wins in terms of disputing ideas around freedom, justice, etc. They're fighting back, or some people. That's not like they, but some people are fighting back. The dispute is happening. It's going to continue to happen. We were you mentioned the foundation of El Museo, right? In the context of like this was the other day in this country. It's not like 1970, 1969, 1968. It's another day, in the history of this country. So I think that it's good to take that into consideration. The experience of being a Brazilian person who grew up in Brazil, grew up learning about art history in our context, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s during the military dictatorship. It was tough. People were actually being kidnapped and murdered by the state. In Brazil, in Argentina, in other places. The numbers are crazy, the stories are crazy, and it is possible to look at this moment and see some echoes in this country, in other parts of the planet. The artists were fighting. The groups were organized. They made incredible work in that time. They found ways to dispute in and out of the institutions all these things related to what is democracy, what's the importance of collectivity, what is the common, so that the fight was happening there at that moment, and it led to another moment. So I think that I don't want to look at this moment and think that we are defeated, that we can't do anything. That our work as curators, so sorry if I'm saying students much, it's kind of we are necessarily political beings. What we do is negotiate by definition. I think that it's a moment for us to look in what we have been doing in the past years in terms of strategies as curators, as people, citizens, human beings, to understand what was wrong and what could be improved. I think we are we have been in this past decades also reverberating some kind of discourse that is, I'm not a citizen, you are a citizen, you're never going to understand me. I'm a person of color, you're a white person, you're never going to understand me. I'm a woman, you're a man, you're never going to understand me. I'm queer or not, you're never going to understand me. This idea that we're not able to understand the other is a death of politics, is a death of negotiation. So how can we learn from this new moment in which we are literally observing people annihilating people because they're not able to negotiate in many parts of the planet? How can we learn from that and figure out we have to negotiate? We have to negotiate in our institutions. We have to negotiate in our neighborhoods, in our communities, societies, contexts. So I think it's a moment for us to calm down a little bit, look at the situation, understand how to talk to people who are different than us, different, divergent, and etc., and see how we can find common ground that can be better for other people. That's how so I'm not desperate. I think I'm very sad about what is happening.
Yeah.
But I refuse to look at the situation and feel that we are not going to be able to do a lot.
Of course, this fear is not a political act.
That's true.
Yeah.
We were talking in the break, that I was saying, actual fear of mine right now is that we get fixated in this moment. And as you're saying, like where we are now is not so different than we were, you know, before the elections. Like it's all, some of what we're feeling, I think, has been systemic or has been building to this now. I'll also say, like, I've been really thinking about like the so-called multicultural 90s. You know, at El Museo, we have our triennial exhibition. We just concluded our second edition called Flow States, which I found have so many repercussions, like with the 93 Whitney Biennale. And so we've been talking about what happened after that 93 Biennale, and is it happening now, which I definitely think it is. And so how can we learn from that? How can we learn from the founding of El Museo? I mean, they didn't have any funding when El Museo was started, and, you know, look at what it's become. I also think we also have to reevaluate, like, as we're moving forward, what does it mean to move forward? Because I think like having like a positivist perspective, like what we thought was improvement or getting better is not necessarily what needs to happen right now. Like things might look different, but like I think survival, and hopefully more than survival, but what it means to thrive may be different, you know, in the next decade than it was in the past decade, you know.
Yeah, I think it's a spectrum, and I think it's important to kind of think about it in that way, and kind of touching on what you all have said is for me, I think it's this idea of like, you know, the word we'd like to think about continuing and as maybe a mode of survival, as a mode of activism, is sort of just still working through it. You know, I was at our archive the other day, and I was talking to our archivist, and sort of like, you know, how the archive is organized, and looking back, and he was pointing out that looking at old grant applications is like very informative. And then we got into this whole like rabbit hole of, you know, the culture wars in that time period. And you can look at like the applications that the kitchen submitted for grants at that time, and you can track exactly like what was happening, what they were doing, what the visioning was, what the tension points were. And I guess that was sort of what informs this idea that, you know, we have to continue, we have to keep pushing forward, because no matter, even though the kitchen was at the time where, you know, shows were being shut down, or institutions were being closed temporarily, or, you know, artists were dying, and it was like they were still trying to be a space that was available, you know, and that could be a place of support regardless of what was happening on the outside. And so I think you know, I think that's how I see my role at the kitchen right now, is to push through and continue to keep this space for artists to experiment and have a voice. And then second to that, which I think you both mentioned, is this idea of collaboration. And I see kind of this way forward is pooling our resources however they may be, whether it's our intellectual resources, whether it's our funding resources, whether it's our space. I mean, this is, you know, we are operating right now in a temporary space and will be for a couple more years. And so it's sort of like, we've already been thinking about that up until this moment where funding is severely affected. And so I think it's a matter of, again, like continuing, but understanding it may not be the same, but different isn't necessarily tragic, right? It's just a different way of pivoting in this moment.
Yeah, I wanted to just build off of what y'all were saying, because I was thinking, I've been thinking the same thing. It's like the work continues. The work has been there the whole time, and it's not different because of this moment. You just continue. It's like slow and steady. You have to keep going. And something that I always think about, which is kind of building on what you were saying, is like Edward Glissant and this idea of a solidarity between intuitions. So how are we in solidarity with each other if we don't know each other? We have to be, we have to be in solidarity with strangers, because that's kind of like the only way that I see forward is like, I'm this with you, with the person outside, and we're in it together. And something, there's like some loose ideas. I have a queer writing group that we meet every couple of weeks to like discuss writing, and we met right after the election, and there was a person that's been has lived through AIDS, all of this, and they were like, we've been here before, let's go. Like we have to learn from like our past colleagues and artists and ways that they navigated through it, because we have to kind of figure out. So learning from the past and just kind of continuing the work and really being in this solidarity of intuitions with each other.
So perhaps with international colleagues, because these experiences are not the same, but very similar. So learning from the experiences that fought against these sort of regimes is also important. What sort of practices? Altogether, it's about freedom of expression and state violence. So I guess they are very similar.
Should we open this up?
Exactly. Some questions online already, but maybe
let's start here, and then maybe you could read.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be great. So who would like to join the conversation? Yes.
Well, thank you all for your contribution. I was just wondering if you might share your thoughts about sort of having maybe less agency, like different degrees of agency within an institution. For example, for people in curatorial roles who are maybe less senior, or sort of navigating maybe a difference in personal position and the position of the institution.
I'll speak to like the latter, because I do think that is one of the most personally challenging components of this profession for me. It relates also to the fact that, or I'm going to relate it to, it's the weekend, here we are in the conference, probably after this I'll go to some shows in Chelsea, then maybe I meet up with an artist, and so that's my weekend. It's also what I like to do, it's my passion. Yourself and your profession can't really be uncoupled, and I think when you're working in an institution, I mean, I know that I as a person am uncoupled from it, but in public life I'm not. And so when the institution maybe does something you don't agree with, you are lumped in with that, and it's hard on like an emotional basis. So I shared with you that example of the Mirror Manifesto. There have been other moments that I've lived through from my career. I have peers who work at other institutions who are dealing with like very public battles. Whether we personally believe whatever stance our position that's taken, it's still really challenging. And that's why I think like also having these colleagues, like I have all of these different cohorts from different moments of my lives. I have like all of these different WhatsApp groups, having those outlets.
Yes.
It's really important to remind yourself also that you're not the institution, no matter how much you love it or at moments hate it. So I think like having, like it sounds cheesy, but having those solidarities and friendships, and I really see the field improving. Like I see a difference from generation to generation. I feel like our current generation, and even like much younger than me, I'm not as young as I think I am. Like you all share so much with each other. It's like really impressive.
I was just talking to another young curator yesterday who works at an institution in Mexico, and I was sharing with her, you know, the art of diplomacy, like trying to like slowly get to where you want and like the ideas and the projects that maybe that you want to move forward. And you really just, there's a couple of things that I learned. It's like, first, you really have to know your stuff and make sure that, you know, you really understand it, that you really know it, that you can really defend it, that you can really get behind it and understand it, and how it's like, and you know, why you advocate for it in the institution that you are. And then the second thing that my, you know, my great boss NG told me is like, always be ready. You never know. There's always going to be like a little gap in the calendar at some point or another that you have 2 seconds to put something together. And that's when you like those opportunities, you know, are important because it's a moment that you're ready. You have the research prepared, you've met with the artists, you have all of it. And that, you know, those moments come. So always be ready for that opportunity or for like another that opens up. I think is like a good thing to just always keep in the mind, you know, not necessarily work on a project because you have the space and this, but because you're always having conversations and you're always seeing where maybe this will take 3 years or this will take 1 year, but you just have to kind of be ready.
100%. I think that for me, something that feels really important from that I was thinking, and you also mentioned is knowing the speed of things. What's going to take time? What can be quick? Like be ready for the moment that you can be quick. But also, other disputes are going to take very long. They're going to take very long. You're going to like little by little present ideas, values, questions. Part of the work you just have to execute. No, write this text. I don't like this artist. All right, write this text. That's part of your job description to support. But also, you're not forced to do things that feel unethical.
Right.
You can also say no. You have your job description, but you also have always the chance to say no to things that feel unethical, unprofessional, or that I'm not going to be the person doing that. You know, so there is also, and there are ways of saying no. I think that being open to these negotiations feels I think really important. And autonomy, it's something that you conquer. Also, it's not something that you're given as freedom, right? So you need to be a little by little, showing that you can be autonomous in your position.
I feel like you've all said the things that I would say. I think diplomacy and collaboration are really key in wading through some of the most difficult points, either from within a project or with being within an institution, and sort of having your community, but also I think engaging with the community that surrounds you is really important and can be rewarding. So even if you feel lost amidst what could be a large or a small institution's moment in time, I think there's reward in the work that we do. And it can, for me, it's most rewarding when you can be sort of engaged, right? Both inside and outside of an institution. And I think what we've all said in various ways, like kind of patience is a real key in understanding the cadence of things.
Does anyone want to answer from the audience as well? Any other thoughts before we entertain another question?
I can really relate to what you said about how we can learn from the past, because I'm from Hungary, so it's another difficult situation, and I was gonna write an article about like how what survival strategies we have as like cultural workers, and I was interviewing an art historian, a very respected like lecturer in Hungary about what his idea is about surviving, and he thought like, oh, let's look at the artists like underground networks in the 1970s in Hungary, when they, like, you know, like organized themselves like against socialist oppression leading them. Was very inspiring to me to think about as a source of inspiration. And I also agree with you in like kind of like in feeling that defeated. It's just really important to inspire us, you know, just, you know, like getting to the negative spiral and you know, to keep going. And there were, I bet, like more difficult periods in history, still development, like there's still projects and books and applications that we're doing, so. It's my.
Anyone else?
When you are speaking from the audience, try to be loud enough so that our online audience can hear you.
Any other question, any comment? Jenny?
Okay, so some of us are like in the process of finding a job in New York, which I know you faced in a moment, and it's like a very vulnerable situation. And I have find it like a very cold and like soulless process of just like writing cover letters and sending emails, and you know, like, and somehow it's very, I don't know, like even interesting to think of how the art world has been able to break so many systems and models of doing things, but we're still attached to these processes that are so false. Especially because maybe the skills that will be needed to work in our field cannot be necessarily reflected on a one-page letter that we can send. So I'm pretty sure that in your paths, in your professional paths, you have faced like these situations. And I was wondering, how do you do it in your institutions? Like, how does these processes work? And do you really like see those cover letters, or is just something that is related to different kind of things? Because sometimes I feel like, okay, maybe I should start sending poems, right? But yeah, we're really tired, and it's very sad to see like culture dealing with this sense of vulnerability and precarity. And I don't know, I was just wondering if you can share a little bit with us.
Yeah, I can speak specifically about the kitchen here in New York. It's the only institution I've worked in New York, so I might have more insight into Chicago institutions, but the kitchen offers annual internships and fellowships. We have an open call period of time where one can submit an application, and we have a small team, but internally we do review everything, and we only have a couple of spots that we can fill, unfortunately, but we feel it's very important to have these opportunities, not only for folks to have a moment of mentorship, but also to work and produce pieces of writing, to be collaborators within projects. And that's one instance within my institution that we ensure is available, and that's for the kind of semester or the year-long internships and fellowships. And then there are semester-based internships that are usually partnerships with institutions. So there's kind of two different modes of entry for those sorts of opportunities. Like some of the other organizations here, we're really small staff, so I think that's part of the, challenge. Larger institutions have more opportunities, more turnarounds, but my experience certainly being, and again, this is Chicago, not New York, but I took my time in grad school to sort of become so involved in the community, from artists to writers and institutions. So it really did help me when I did find myself without a job when my gallery owner passed away, that I was able to really kind of call into the network, and it was because I was kind of trying to do as much as I could while I was in grad school, whether it was writing for free or kind of being part of any instance that I could be involved in. Which is, I know easier said than done, but I think it is important to sort of execute your network and not be afraid to cold email, show up at an opening, talk to people. So I mean, it's tricky it's challenging to do, but it is part of what we all do all the time. That never stops, actually, especially from a funding perspective. You have to consistently be assertive and be an advocate. So in this moment, you're an advocate for yourself, but it's a good skill to hone in on, because you then have to advocate for your artists and your institution later on.
Stuff all of us go through these at the beginning, but for the entire life, really. But you have to imagine that this person who's on the other side is also going to be working in precarious conditions with not a lot of time, not a lot of funds. So we're going to be reading hundreds of cover letters, and I'm sure that these people us and other people would love to be more human, but the structure of the institutions doesn't hold necessarily space for this. Making cover letters or applications is a form of art. Really,
Really is.
but I think it's an important thing to imagine the other side, who's going to be reading in which conditions, because then you can strategize a little bit about how to shape that into whatever you want to transmit in your letter. But I want to say, great. I think it's great to want to work in New York, but the world is so gigantic, and New York is great. We are all here. It's not the center of the planet. There are tons of places and that people can work. And also, I'm always going to be an advocate. If you don't find a place that you would love to work, make it. Both New York and the world could use other institutions, and institutions that can be built with different values, different structures, that can defend throughout time, surviving its founders, other power structures that the current institutions are not able to. So I'll always advocate for that.
Yeah, I was thinking the same. I mean, I graduated from this program and was in a similar situation come May of finding work, and I was very committed to staying in New York. And then I was like, I'll go anywhere. I'll literally go anywhere. So that brought me to San Francisco, which, I actually loved living there for that time. It's a, beautiful, complicated city. But I think it was that switch of, wait, yeah, I should just go anywhere. And it doesn't actually matter if I stay here or go somewhere else, especially early on in your career, and you're single. If you can, it's not the same possibility for people maybe that have families or that have to move around differently. But that was the first thing. And then the second thing, I mean, I've read through now, we hired a curatorial assistant at SFOMA, and we had several interns over the summer, and we have a fellow now that was just starting. It's the first collaboration that we do with the Asymmetry Foundation, which is a foundation focused on the sinosphere. But when we look at them, and I think what really is important in that one page that you have is what makes your perspective and experience your own. It's such an easy thing, but it's you're looking at so many. It's what are you after in terms of the work and the ideas? What makes you kind of what drives you to take this, perspective. Because I think, if you're looking for a curatorial assistant, you need somebody that can do the work and has that experience of like the admin, and you can rely on them, and that they know how to do that part. But also, I think that we all think about like mentorship and mentoring others. It's like, what will your ideas, your position contribute to the institution, but also how can we help you kind of grow into another stage of your practice or your work?
I mean, I don't have that much more to add either. I was gonna say, like, New York is not like the center of the universe, like artistically either. And I guess maybe the only thing I'll like pivot from, like, again, I like came maybe the most traditional path of you all, although I had periods of unemployment at multiple stages. Like when I graduated, I've quit jobs without other jobs, which is very powerful. But unlike you all, I think what I wish I had done was like, first of all, again, you're in New York, you can go to all these openings and forget meeting us. You can be artists. Artists are always creating their opportunities, and like, you could be the person who's like, you get my art. Like, I'm gonna tell, when I'm doing a project, I'm gonna tell the curator, I want you to be the writer for this show. So, and that will get you in through another way. So like, I don't think, again, I'm like, I feel like the most square here. I kind of went like, it was very lucky. So much of what happened was serendipitous, but there's other ways, like I see them and they're often the most interesting.
Thank you. So I'll read a question from an online audience and then go back to an audience question if that's possible. So Dagim Abebe from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia asks this questions. And actually he asked 3 questions. I'm going to read all of them and just respond whatever. And you don't have to go through all the questions. You can jump in whatever is more interesting for you. So one is, to what extent and for how long can curators shape or influence an artist's creative process, conceptual approach, and career trajectory? 2, what ethical considerations should curators take into account when exhibiting African cultural and spiritual objects, particularly those that hold deep communal and spiritual significance? 3rd, in contemporary curatorial practice, how can curators navigate the tension between artistic appropriation, cultural sensitivity, and the historical displacement of objects?
Wow.
Okay. This wasn't directly focused, but I'm glad these questions also exist. Anyone would like to?
I might attempt to address the first, which I maybe might actually push back on, which is that I don't necessarily feel that I would say a curator has an influence over an artist. I see it, I think that relationships can be lifelong. They also can be project-based. But I see it as again, I can say it over a collaborative, like everything, I see everything within, I do as a collaboration. So I don't feel that I have an influence over any artists I've worked with, but I stay in touch with them. I might read something and like reach out to them and say, hey, so-and-so, who I worked with 10 years ago, I just read this thing and whatnot. So I don't know, I feel like it's a continual relationship. So I push back against this kind of influence. Of course, if an artist is working with a curator on a particular project, there is a back and forth about, again, managing expectations and what is possible. I think that's a very important role that curators have when executing a project. But I would say I see it more as a relationship. And I strive to always keep a relationship with any artists that I work with or don't work with. But I know there are times where those relationships don't work out and they also end. So I don't know, that was something that stuck out to me where I was like, I don't really see it that way. Maybe others disagree, but
You can feel free to answer any other question.
I mean, maybe I'll tackle, I think, an aspect of the 3rd question relating to spirituality or the potency of artworks or forms. Sometimes I'll, at El Museo del Barrio, we do show Afro-diasporic forms, like in the case of the Mr. Gigi show, a candomblé artist, practitioner. I mean, I'm speaking with Bernardo, so you should step in as you know the work much more. But we've also shown works associated with Santeria and voodoo practices. And we have Taino forms, ancient Taino forms that are part of our collection. So we're also touching on like the historical and provenance issues associated with, you know, holding that and what does that mean? Especially with the Taino forms, you know, we do see El Museo as having like a slightly different position than like some other institutions, being that we are embedded in, again, not a community, many communities, but you know, when El Museo was formed, those Taino forms really became a way for artists living in New York and the community of New York to see, you know, part of their cultural history that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. And we recently presented as part of a collection show. We had a section called O Kama Rapoel, which in the Taino language means a calling of the ancestors, in which we presented works by contemporary artists who were drawing on Taino forms in their work alongside the ancient forms, making that dialogue. But we also, you know, we're very concerned and like, how do we present these works? So in the case of the Taino presentation, we convened a council of Taino elders from Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. So that's not to say it was all encompassing of the Caribbean, but we wanted, you know, representation from different cultural specificities to really talk to us about how we should engage with these forms. Should we engage with these forms? We held a number of both private and public ceremonies so that we were, you know, asking the objects for their permission, they're, you know, making sure that they were happy to be on view in the galleries. It's really interesting. I'm not a practitioner of really any religion. So for me, I really came to some of those ceremonies with a lot of anxiety, like curatorial anxieties. Like, what if the forms don't want to be on view? Like, what are we gonna do? How are we gonna do this presentation? And I finally like confessed my anxiety to one of the council members, and they were like, if you all are asking from the right perspective, the forms will say yes. And that has been, I think like that has been a way that we've approached, I think since then, all of these different objects, forms, artworks, you know, they're all different contexts, but how we're trying to bring them to El Museo, where I do think we have a really important and vital you know, audience members who come from a lot of different spiritual and religious backgrounds, and really they, I think, see and experience the objects differently than I do. And I think like in many ways in a more vital and potent way. And I think that's the case with the Mr. Gigi show, which is up right now. So I hope you can all come and visit. And it's something, you know, we have to think about it when it comes to not just presentation, but public programs. And also, you know, when these works go back, like our Taino works, when they go back into storage, like we think about what that means for those forms.
Anyone else?
I mean, I'll just add something to both questions. It's like the best part, I mean, to me too, about curatorial work is this ability to like shapeshift, for each of the projects required a different set of approaches and a different set of research questions and a different set of you know, like like presentations and language, and how do you kind of navigate through that. I'm also working, it's interesting because it's like separate examples, but I'm working with an artist who's much younger than Mr. Didi, but I think was very influenced by him, also Brazilian, from Brazil, that her practice is in a way spiritual. She doesn't necessarily always need, you know, the work doesn't need to manifest that, but I've had to do a lot of research and writing, like to understand the context, to understand the religious kind of, you know, place where that work is coming from so that I can write about it in a way that isn't attaching it to her biography again, because that to her is not so important, but so I can then present on the work itself and its meaning and its so all of, I mean, I think that I say this because that's kind of the best part, that each project is like, oh, now I have to research this, like, you know, Lacan psychoanalysis and like the history of dolls, and now I have to research like Candomblé, like, you know, you kind of from all these different places.
And sometimes you have to invite other people too.
Yes.
For the conversation,
Yes.
because we are definitely shifters. Is that a good
Yeah.
question? But there's a limit, right?
Yeah.
We are only taught, or we only learn certain languages on how to listen, hear, connect with the world, right? So it is true that if you're open-hearted talking to a piece, the piece can say yes, but sometimes it's gonna say no. You can also say no, and then you need to know how to hear the no and respect the no, or you have to look for someone who is able to communicate with the piece. The question, what's the name of the person? I don't remember, but the question of this person feels a little bit far from what we have been discussing, but also not, because it's still negotiation, right? Not the negotiation with the board or with government, but the negotiation with the things themselves and the power that they have, right? In that sense, I think it's an amazing question. I had one exhibition in my presentation that I skipped, that was precisely an exhibition talking or putting together works that are related to different forms of spirituality in the same exhibition. But in that case, it's a show called The Precious Life of a Liquid Heart, show kind of bringing together how artists that were part of different cosmologies and spiritual communities relate to the water crisis in Latin America. And in that sense, we had artists that were Shipibo Conibo in Peru, thinking about water together with the practice of the Kenne. We had Nadia Taquari with Oshun and talking about the rivers from this perspective. We had Seba Calfuqueo, Mapuche from Chile, with a video that was later at the Whitney Biennial, talking about also the river and etc. So there were a number of works that were absolutely spiritual or dealing with spirituality, but the artists themselves were giving, right, the consent, and they had their responsibility themselves. The other situations are more complicated when those works are stolen or when they are acquired in unfair ways or trafficked, etc. They end up in the museums, and then the museums need to figure out what to do and how to talk to them. And in these cases, we have like emblematic situations like Cap Henry in Paris, in which the whole building is built around a cylinder with drums, silent drums, from all across the planet. I find it so meaningful that this entire museum that is about primitive art from all the places on the world but Europe, because they are not primitive, the primitive are elsewhere, is built around a display of silence and how to make these objects silent. It's not to believe that these objects are silent. It's not only a lack of ability. It is a choice. It is a choice to make them silent. And we can have the chance to learn how to listen to them and to invite other people to listen to their own abilities too, because they talk.
So I was thinking about building program in your institutions, because Susanna was saying about like this connection to the beginning, like all institutions work with history, different times and ages. But Rob is also talking about Rob is also about like interests and curiosities and projects that have come like across with you for years. So I was wondering if you can tell a little bit about like this idea of like in your time in your institutions, how you work with like building programming, like and think about the timings of the exhibitions and considering all these aspects, because I know it's also another way of negotiating with the institution itself, but your roles as curator were so like relevant in this part too.
Sure, I can talk, I'll talk about the kitchen, mainly because, I mean, I did do programming at the Art Institute, but it was, maybe more formulaic in a way that's sort of, depending on the scale of the exhibition is what would inform the kind of programming, and sort of we're talking about like development, the development department at SF moment. That like the Art Institute has its own learning and public engagement and department that I was not in, so they kind of manage that. So what's one of the many things that I was very excited to be at the kitchen about is I have more of a role in programming that aligns with the exhibitions, the things that we're doing. As I started a year and a half ago, at the beginning of this fall, we actually had hired a full-time person to be a part of the education, to be the education program essentially. So we're building it now. And it's a really, I think, inspiring and sometimes challenging notion to sort of think about what is our community, who is our community, right? The kitchen has a 50-year history. We are very much a part of lots of different communities in New York, and there are a lot of communities we're not a part of. And I think that that's something that is really important for those of us that are on staff right now, as we look to the next 50 years of the institution. Like a micro example is myself and Rich Johnson, who's our new manager of education. We're very interested in thinking about what different aged communities look like inside the kitchen. Because if you think about it, our history is really dealing with communities that are old enough to go to very late performances, right? Which is very important to us, but at the same time, it's sort of like, what does it look like for others? And I think our physical location right now, being in West Beth Artist Housing, there's lots of different age folks. And last summer, we, as part of the West Side Cultural Fest, which is all these institutions that are on the West Side, there's a weekend in July where it's sort of like a moment for everyone to visit. We invited a former kitchen artist and a former resident of West Beth who know each other and are both practitioners of Tai Chi. We did like a Tai Chi program during this weekend. So it was this really wonderful moment of movement where this was actually not for children, but folks above children, 12, I think, were invited to come and be at the kitchen, but also take part of, different part of like movement and meditation. And Bridget and I are working on how that can look across different generations. For Lisa Alvarado's exhibition, we kicked off the exhibition with a set of performances, but actually Lisa is going to come back with her partner, Joshua Abrams, who's a musician and composer and leads Natural Information Society, the band that she's in. We're actually doing a family program, which the kitchen's never done. So, I mean, we used to have there used to be block parties, I guess, in the 90s and the 2000s, where they would just block off 19th Street, and it was lots of different programming took place. But in the most recent history, so, we'll have a concert for children. And we're going to do a guided meditation in the space and kind of explore what that looks like. So all this is to say is I'm now in a space where we're planning things in real time, which can sometimes be messy, but I find it to be quite exciting, and gets away from the rubric of, metrics and audience numbers and these sorts of things. And so we're trying to think more openly and abstractly. And really kind of opening up the kitchen, which is alignment also with this Without Walls program, which is to try to like push forth the ideas and the mission of the kitchen that isn't necessarily like, you have to come to us, right? We want to like come to you. And so that's something that's not fully in practice, but it is part of our scope that we're working towards right now.
I mean, I'll just say, I think I was interpreting your question differently, but I think you were also talking about like programming exhibitions themselves too. And like, I want to really echo what you said that Angie shared with you, which is like, always have your ideas, like Domestica Nets, which I think was really like quite a modest installation of mine. It was just 2 galleries. It has really been really pivotal for my curatorial practice. There was a slot in the calendar and I made that show happen in like 5 months, which is crazy. Or I should say like El Museo, and I think probably, I'm curious to hear from you all, like as a small institution, we have like our 5-year plan. but things move around all the time. And so I have like a more thought out program that I would love to see executed. It won't happen in the way like that I'm envisioning it. It's really, I think it's this long marathon that we're all in. And like, as you said, Bernardo, sometimes you end up writing about an artist, like maybe it wasn't your first choice. I haven't, I'm in my new role now, and as far as being able to set the program, but until you get, and even so, there will be these external forces that are gonna, they're gonna like move things around for you, and maybe you never do your dream exhibition, but maybe you do something else
Right.
that takes on a different resonance.
I think I mentioned the Greg Bordowitz exhibition I did at the Art Institute. It was a wild example because we had something fall through and we were able to do the exhibition in 8 months, which was sort of like warp speed for an institution like that. And it is because I have been trying to pitch just doing a small video show. And so kind of being able to have a relationship with an artist and then think about expanding it, I think just supports what everyone is saying here.
You don't have to answer.
Yeah, and actually there is one more question waiting here. It may be, unless you have something really to add, you don't feel obliged to. So maybe one of you can answer this question, because I guess everyone is also getting tired and hungry. Tracy Levitt asked this question, and she's in the board press of a small membership museum in the Mid-Hudson Valley. And says, so I'm interested in hearing more thoughts about what the relationship between boards and the director and or the curatorial team is like or should be like. So speaking of negotiations, etc., maybe one of you could respond to that.
I'll talk about, I was coming from myself where the board is very involved, even as you don't think it is. It always is like maneuvering things. And so my last round of interviews at SculptureCenter, Carol Beauvais was part of that panel, who is the chair of our board. And something that I asked was, how involved are you in the conversations that we have? And she said, do what you need to do. They're very present, and that we have my director has regular check-ins with her specifically, and with the board, we have, every couple of months we have board meetings, but they really do. I feel grateful because they do, they're supportive and they're aware, obviously, of our program and very engaged, but they also just let us kind of take the lead, which I think is, refreshing and not the case for a lot of boards. So I would say for this person on the board too, that it is great to have that dialogue with your director and with curators and understanding kind of the program is, but really that's what we're hired to do in a way, to really lead the program and work with artists. So to really let that happen, I think is important, to both be there and be supportive, but also let others kind of shape it.
That's your pitch.
That's my pitch to this board.
Anyone else?
The ideal relationship between a board and a team is support, right? It's like listening, contributing, and supporting the vision and the work of the curators and directors. That's why a board exists, right? To offer support, not only financial, but also interlocution, feedback, network, etc. But I think that maybe the most important thing for any of these negotiations that we have been talking about here is for me at least, is to be able to imagine the other side, why the other person is in this relationship, why this can be your assistant curator, this can be your director, this can be your board member, like why this person is involved with this institution, and knowing about the positions. I think the relationship can be more well nurtured, let's say. But if in a short answer, the best relationship expected from a board is board.
Right. Is there any other question, Gemma?
Thank you all for your talks today. So my question is, as a person approaching starting a curatorial program, obviously in your first, your interaction with artists and your relationship with artists is something that grows and helps you kind of inform your own, curatorial focus. And I wonder if you ever received feedback from an artist, or if you have questions that you like to ask artists, or what you kind of feel like is the most important part of that relationship to protect, because obviously it could be something of, you talk about diplomacy throughout the institution, there's probably a reality where it's supportive, it's advocacy, it's, maybe there's challenging one another, and you touched on this a little bit about the kind of influence question, but I guess just like, have you ever, or there's something that you wish you could have done differently with an artist, just, I guess it's a kind of a multifaceted question, but just talking about that relationship and like how you've grown into that or kind of approached it.
This will be a full panel. Like another completely long and complex matter. Because this is a great part of what we do when we are working with artists. It's really like a lot. But I think that an ethical commitment to supporting the artist and its development is key. And helping the artists to go nurturing these artists to go beyond themselves. For me, at least, is what motivates me. Especially here in the US, artists that go to art schools, they tend to be really. They have kind of a standard way of talking about themselves, presenting themselves. So you need a lot of work to break that, to be able to let them say things that they have never said before, to question things that they have been saying about themselves for years. So there's a specific kind of work that needs to be done for artists that studied here. But in general, connect, support, be loyal to them, and loyal to this relationship between the artist and the institution. Because at the end, you're holding the two forts at the same time. Anyone else?
I would just say when working with an artist on a project, I think always being direct and upfront and honest as much as you can to manage expectations. Because there's really nothing worse than maybe over or underestimating. So I find that to be a very important thing to adhere to within a working relationship with an artist.
All right. So with that, thanks to everyone online. Thanks to everybody here. We can just mix and do the networking that we do. I'll just make a couple of announcements. On April 8th at 6:30 in this space, we'll have what is called our Distinguished Global Curator Lecture, Carolyn Christoph Bakarjev, who's one of the most influential curators and directors in the world, will be delivering the lecture. So that's April 8th at 6:30. Then on April 22nd, we will have Maria Lind here with scholar, theorist, curator Carolina Rito in conversation. And the last thing is we have now started a journal called The Curatorial, which is at thecuratorial.net. So please look at that, suggest essays, become a subscriber, etc. So thanks to everyone.